Good morning. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us here at the nonfiction panel. We have some amazing speakers today. We'll sit. First, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the unceded traditional territories of the Salish and Kalish Bay peoples, and to honor their commitment to the land and the water that nourishes us. Nikki Zambon is going to open with a reading. And did I say it wrong?
No, that's
and then the panel will commence. Nikki.
Thank you. Maybe I'll stand. Just put it there. There we go. Hi. I'm Nikki Zambon. I am a Montana writer, and I'm really excited to be here, so thank you for listening. This is one part of a larger series about my time spent in South America, and it is called Patangas. He didn't tell me his real name until we were already engaged 6 months. It happened on a road in the Atacama Desert of Chile, the driest place on earth. We were stuck in the shadow of rain. This stretch of land, forced to become a desert, was uniquely positioned between the Great Andes, which obstructed the Amazon's humid breeze, and a tall mountain range that carried cold ocean air high above, just out of Atacama's reach, a coastal desert. We wagged our thumbs at the few cars that whizzed by. The orange clay cracked beneath the spinning tires, giving rise to vicious storms of sand and salt that bit our bare ankles. Scientists likened its soil to the iron crust of Mars, near barren. We had already been in this desert for 4 days, sleeping on its ancient floor, knocking on doors for soup and bread. Por favor, ¿tienes sopa? By then, I had lost 20 pounds. My backpack weighed 40. We hitchhiked out of Colombia nearly 2 months before, headed to Uruguay, my fiance's home. After weeks of listening to 70s disco in the passenger seats of lonely semi-truck drivers, we found ourselves stuck in San Pedro. The Atacama is known for its brilliant night sky. People travel from across the world to pin themselves to the dark desert floor and observe the cosmos. Not that we knew anything about that then. It wasn't even a thought in our heads to pay to see things in the countries we had skipped across like stones. We couldn't afford it. Those places were nothing more to us than lovely blurs from the car windows as we sped towards a new home. We moved out of necessity, not curiosity. We slept on flattened cardboard boxes in terminals, parks, and sidewalks, slept where we slept so that we could get up and walk, or catch a ride to the next place, wherever that was, to find food, to sleep, to work for a little money, to hear stories from strangers who thought our unpolished faces could use a dose of generosity, a dose of reality, a little something to take the edge off. We obliged. We listened, we drank, bowed our heads to the gracious bus drivers, picked the crusted lint from our thin pockets when we were bored, and became so familiar with dirty looks that eventually every stranger's mouth resembled a single folded line. Yet we knew none of this really mattered. What mattered was getting to Uruguay. All the light and color flooding our eyes, a flash, a blip too small to call memory. But sometimes, no matter how badly you wanted to move on, you just couldn't catch a ride. So in the dry heat of the day, we wandered San Pedro. The short, cream-colored buildings were stacked together so tightly that the air around us felt wilted and thin. And what little remained of the air had been claimed by a lingering cloud of pale dust, drawn up from the beaten road with every passing step. We walked slowly through the little streets, amazed at the number of tour guide shops displaying photos of blue violet and green galaxies. We pressed our faces against these glass windows and cupped our hands around our eyes to see stars collide and form great arches that look like they belong behind God's eye, an optomap of the unknown. I'd never seen stars like that, not even in Montana, my first home. A state with wide open air, so impressive that it's known at once as big sky and dark sky country. But maybe I exaggerated those night skies. After all, everything appears bigger in memories. So, with our final pesos gifted by a stranger who had seen me vomit on the road from sun poisoning, we bargained with the guide and secured a spot on a stargazing tour. We didn't even care that we traded a day's worth of food to look through a telescope. We left the streets to play in the sand dunes at the end of town. It was free, and if we dug our bodies deep enough, the grains became coarse and cool against our skin. We watched children slide down the dunes on homemade boards and trash bags. And when I asked one boy to let me try, he stuck his tongue out and ran away. His mother laughed. My fiancé and I only fought once or twice that day. We both carried fear in our gut like bacteria. We were self-conscious and suspicious of people even in the best of times. But the lack of food, showers, and sleep left our moods frighteningly unpredictable. We danced on the dunes and then slapped each other for falling out of rhythm. We constantly worried that the other was ogling a clean, attractive passerby. But in reality, we were only ever keeping a watchful eye on each other, behaving like a couple of hot-mouthed, hungry dogs tussling in the sand drifts. But that day, our hostility was scarce and brief. And when the dunes finally pulled all the water from our skin, we walked back to town. We smoothed our hair and strolled through tourist shops, chins perked, feigning interest, just to look at more of those colorful night sky pictures. Usually two empty-handed travelers, that day we were more. We were tourists. When the sun set, we jogged over to the pickup location. We layered our bodies with the filthy clothes from our packs, preparing for the brisk night ahead, and stowed the nearly empty bags behind the shop counter, warning the tour guide not to steal them because we'd have to leave him in the desert for dead. The three of us laughed, but my fiancé and I were only ever half joking when it came to our backpacks, those little mobile cities that we wore like hunches knotted into our spine. It never felt right to leave them in the care of others, and unless you were us, there was nothing of great value to be found within them. Bits of driftwood into which we carved Donny Holloway lyrics, a Ziploc baggie full of small dissolving seashells, smooth gray stones to suck on when we were thirsty or anxious, a beloved dress too nice to actually wear, a handful of desert sand. The sort of things worth vaguely threatening people over just because they were ours, our memories. But excitement surpassed doubt when we were giddy like kids. Gradually, the other tourists arrived in flurries of Spanish, Portuguese, and French. We loaded into the large black van and started the 30-minute drive to our remote location. Together, we all sang the chorus of Fly Me to the Moon, over and over in a sort of drunken English, until the guide stopped laughing and barked at us to quiet down. I turned to watch the artificial lights shrink away as we drove farther down an open road made of sand and rock. After what felt like much longer than half an hour, we arrived at our destination. An ill-fitted colonial-style building sat by itself way out in the dark, an abandoned dollhouse. Several wicker chairs draped with thick cotton blankets were arranged in a half moon on the solid dirt lawn. Giant telescopes were scattered across the property, noses pointed skyward. We were taken inside to grab bags of pretzels, over which my fiancé and I cried with joy, and small cups of red wine. Once we were seated outside, the guide began describing the different galaxies and constellations that could be seen with the naked eye. The southern stars, Orion's nebula, the Milky Way, the Southern Cross. There were two language options, English and Spanish. Neither my fiancé nor I could properly speak the other's native tongue, so we opted for English, because I wanted to hear how the constellations got their names, and he wanted to lay back in his chair and understand nothing. But I could barely pay attention to the guide's words. I kept glancing back and forth between those faraway lights and those big telescopes. At last, we were free to peer into the lenses and search for things mentioned in the stories. Jupiter's moons, Saturn's hazy belt loop, a sinking arrow, maybe the arch of a woman's back. And with every dash of velvet light that split into focus, I thought, that's no Montana sky. As a girl, I'd lay on the roof of my dad's old Lincoln log cabin in Georgetown and watch meteor showers pelt the August night. I remember sneaking out at dark to climb a wobbly wooden ladder, carrying a blanket and a small stuffed animal to place beneath my head. Flares of green, orange, and silver shined above me while I held my breath until the next one struck. Finally, just before my eyes fell closed, my dad called me down. And as I descended that splintered ladder, I wondered where all those meteors disappeared to. But the Atacama sky was not what I imagined. There were no blue-violet arches like the pictures had shown. It was just a very dark night with a spread of white. When I finally tapped the guide on the shoulder and asked where all the colors could be seen, he laughed and told me the photos from the tourist shops were taken with special infrared cameras, which made the galaxies appear colorful. That's not what they really look like to us. I flushed with embarrassment. As the night wore on, I peeked over at my fiancé and saw that he had fallen asleep in his chair. All the anticipation and lack of food left him spent. I excused myself to use the restroom and quickly slipped one of the bottles of wine beneath my coat. When I returned, I shook him awake and we moved outside of the circle of observers to drink in silence. A sadness swept over that was hard to describe. Yes, we felt foolish for thinking the sky would be any other color than what we'd seen. That we gave up 2 bowls filled to the brim with steaming chicken stew just to look at the same stars we'd been nesting beneath these past few nights. But it wasn't just that, it was us. We had met in the midst of searching for something more, and that night it became clear we had never stopped searching. Every single thing we found or muscled our way into having was never enough. We had made promises. We had created adventure. We had a destination, a goal, a life. I just needed to stay focused, I told myself. This fall sky was just another roadside attraction I could leave behind, barely a memory. But at that moment, in the wide and cold desert, beneath that enormous canopy of pearl-studded black, I glimpsed the end.
Thank you so much, Nikki. The hot breath of hungry dogs. Yeah. All right, I'm going to introduce our panel. I have the books here, so I'm going to also show you their beautiful books. Courtney Zoffness is the author of Spilt Milk, named Best Debut of 2021 by Bookpage and Refinery 29, and a must-read by LitHub, The Millions, and Good Morning America. Also a fiction writer, she won the Sunday Times Short Story Award, the most valuable international prize for short fiction amid entries from 38 countries. Other honors include fellowships from the Center for Fiction and MacDowell. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review, the New York Times, and other outlets. She directs the creative writing program at Drew University and lives with her family in Brooklyn, New York, and we are honored to have you with us. Thank you, Courtney. Jamie Gehring is a Montana native who grew up sharing a backyard with Ted Kaczynski, if you can imagine. The man widely known as the Unabomber. She was featured in Netflix's Unabomber, in his own words, where she discussed her family's role in Ted's capture. Her debut braided memoir, Will Hit You Right in the Heart, Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabomber, represents not only true crime, but true life. Thank you, Jamie, for being with us. Teow Lim Goh is the author of 2 poetry collections, Islanders from 2016 and Faraway Places 2021, and this right here, forthcoming essay collection, Western Journeys, which is actually due out next month, but Fact and Fiction worked super hard to get copies here early. And I'm not going to brag, but I think I am the first person to ever buy a copy of this book, and I squealed when I saw it on the table out there. It's gorgeous. I mean, look at that. So she's getting to hold her book for the very first time this weekend, and that's pretty darn amazing. I lost my space. Teow's essays, poetry, and criticism have been or will be featured in the Georgia Review, Beloit Poetry Journal, Los Angeles Review of Books, PBS NewsHour, and The New Yorker. Thank you so much for being here with us. And me, I'm your host, Keema Waterfield. My memoir, Inside Passage, is a nomadic childhood coming-of-age story set along the wild coast of Southeast Alaska. I've written for the New York Times, Wired, Brevity, Scary Mommy, Insider, and other places. I live here in Missoula, where I moonlight as a stand-up comic when I'm not wrangling my kids and my husband and a collection of assorted rescue animals. So we are excited to get started with our chat. We're going to ask each other a couple of questions, and then if we're lucky, we'll get through some like writing our book process questions, and then maybe some craft conversation, and hopefully a little time to answer any audience questions that arise. Teow, I was going to start with you. Your book is a collection of essays about external subjects such as place, immigration, and art, all of which is informed by your personal experience. Can you speak to how you chose what to disclose or withhold, and how you approach using personal experience to frame larger subjects? And I'm going to bring the mic to you. Oh, there is another one. But does it work? Jamie knows.
I think so, yes.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for the question, and thanks all of you for being here. And the way I describe my work, at least this particular book, like she said, I'm holding this for the first time, and it's more of essays that draw on personal experience to illuminate larger subjects rather than memoir per se. But I feel that all of us experience the world from a subjective lens, whether it's race or gender or class or simply just, what our lives have been. And, a very benign example that I have is that someone who grew up in the mountains in a place like this would experience the oceans differently than someone who grew up on an island. And it doesn't mean that, one way is more valid than the other. But you will just see different things, you will experience different things, you will make different meanings. And I kind of bring that concept to bigger subjects such as history, politics, art, environmental issues. I do think of history as the accumulation of individual lives and experiences, and it's often driven by private and intimate impulses, but these larger forces also shape our private worlds. So one of the issues that I discuss extensively in my book is immigration. And I moved here from Singapore 19 years ago. And obviously my path is a lot more privileged than, say, the Chinese who came during the Chinese Exclusion Act era, or the Mexican immigrants, or the Latin American immigrants at the Mexico border. But having that experience helps me see, see through some of the issues that, someone else who might not have. On the other hand, I also acknowledge that my experience is very different. So when we use personal experience to frame larger subjects, I feel it does two things. One is it establishes our subject position in relation to the subject. Where do our views come from? Who are we in relation to the story? And it also humanizes this discussion versus abstract rhetoric. Going back to the immigration example, I feel that a lot of the debates, if it feels like, people trying to win the debate versus talking about actual people and their lives. So bringing in that, that human level, I think, brings a a more nuanced and deeper level discussion, of detail and ideas to the discussion. Um, as for what I chose to include and exclude, um, so there is very little about the specifics of my private life in the book, and it was a deliberate decision, in the sense that I didn't. It wasn't the focus of the book. I wrote these pieces as individual essays first. Most of them have been previously published. But when I put them into a book, I realized that there was a personal arc, which is my struggle to exercise voice and develop credibility. But if I wanted to write the backstory to that, that's a whole nother book. So I do lay it out there that was my struggle, but I didn't go into, a lot of details. But what I revealed more was the process of grappling with the material and trying to understand, the material in this particular framework. So yeah.
Which part?
Any of it. Because you also write about multiple subjects from your personal perspective.
I do. So my book is hyper personal, and though it's a bit of a trick in that I've had people read it and say, "I feel like I know everything about you," or "I feel like this is an autobiography." And while, unlike Teow, I did open a lot of doors into super personal, vulnerable places, most of what's most tender and personally difficult for me is actually not in the book. So I think that's a little bit of a trick that, maybe I shouldn't call it a trick, it sounds deceitful, but this is, these are choices that memoirists have to make about what you feel comfortable sharing for all kinds of reasons and what you want to withhold. And I had to make these decisions sort of case by case. I write a lot about a difficult relationship I have with my mother, and so many of the sort of tender stories of our arc don't make it in there. What was most important to me, and one of the questions I asked in order to decide what stayed in and what did not, was to ensure that every character, and I use this word even though it's nonfiction, myself too, every character was featured in shade and in light, which is to say, I am a deeply flawed person, as we all are, and I in no way wanted to present myself as the authority on somebody else's ethical choices or behaviors, only to talk about the ways in which these may have impacted me, subjectivity again. So it was important that I showed a lot of my flaws and that I also showed some people who are very flawed in bright light. And this is one way I could justify sharing intimate details about other people who weren't the writers of the book and who didn't have a say in its publication.
I can definitely speak to that too. In my memoir, I do tell quite a lot of my mother's story in order to make sense of the choices that she made, which led me into harm's way. I spent a great deal of time thinking about how and what to include so that she was a real person making real human choices who had also been informed by another real person making very real choices that had led us, generationally to where I was in my childhood. I was limited as a child narrator in that I wasn't able to back up all the time and just sit and make sense and just tell you what happened. So when my mom first read a copy of my manuscript, I didn't even know I was writing a memoir back then. It was just a collection of essays. And she said, I didn't mean to be the bad guy in your story. And I realized that she couldn't see the light parts yet because I don't think I had written them fully enough for her to outbalance the other parts. But after the book was finished, she read it and she laughed and cried like through the night, and in the next morning said, "This is a painful story. It's true and it's funny and it's yours, and you don't need my permission to tell it, but you have it if you want it." And that doesn't happen all the time in memoir, especially when you are telling so much of another person's story. I wanted personally to leave out. There is a chapter that is challenging where there is harm, and I titled it "The Hard One." It's very obvious. If you buy the book, you could just skip it if you need to.
Or you zoom right to it.
Or you zoom right to it. Some people do. I had really been tempted to leave it out. I initially just wanted to write a collection of like humorous essays. I love humor. I'm into it. But then I realized that I was not a full person on the page because my oddities did not make sense if you did not know why I was a wacko. And so I wound up having to include parts of my story that I initially would have liked to, never maybe ever publish. And including it, I think, is real and true to myself. And the question I always asked myself as I was incorporating anyone else's story in the pursuit of telling essentially what is a mother-daughter love story was, does this move the story forward? Does it need to be here? Or am I trying to use this for some other purpose? And it meant that actually quite a number of people, quite a number of stories were left out because they were tangential to the ultimate mother-daughter story thread, which means I have like 3 other memoirs I could potentially write, and I won't, but that's what I say. I think I'm holding to it, but maybe that's just because I released this thing during pandemic with very small kids at home, and I need like 7 years to breathe before I can contemplate writing memoir again. Yeah. I'm going to hand this off to you because I think maybe you have some ideas about this.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say that I'm really glad that you just answered that question because it was one of my questions. Reading your book, I absolutely love, the scene in which your mother reads the book, and that you didn't ask for permission, but it was important to you and your relationship, because I think as a memoirist, it's our story. But personally for me, I wrote a braided memoir, which just means it's not only my story. It is the story of, a serial killer, the longest running domestic terrorist in United States history. And there's so much darkness in that history, in that story. But it was also so close to my heart, my childhood, and I felt such a strong responsibility to tell all of the story, not just the grim details that we've all heard on the news. And so I also asked for permission once I wrote my manuscript, and it was really important to me that Ted Kaczynski's brother, David Kaczynski, approved of my story and my work and what I had written about him and his family, because putting myself in that position, if I was the one under, the spotlight, I would want to have a say. And it's a really hard thing to do, to put yourself out there. And, he knew that I didn't need his permission, but, once he read the book, he gave me his blessing, and was so complimentary of the story and how I really tried to connect with the very human parts of his brother, and also really tell the story of Ted's mother and what she went through, and trying as a mother myself to connect with that on such a human level. So I think that's a huge responsibility when we're writing about these topics.
I want to add just one more point about rendering other people on the page. I've received really good advice from a fellow memoirist. Her name is Keema Waterfield. She wrote a beautiful book called Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, which I highly recommend. And I was asking her some questions about how to let others who appeared in these pages know that this book was forthcoming, and how to handle the question of permission, because if you're asking someone for permission, you have to be prepared that they won't grant it, and then you have to be prepared for what you're going to do then. So you're really cornering yourself with a question like that. So if there are aspiring memoirists in the room, she gave me great advice, which was just to say, I've written this thing and I want to share it with you, without point blank asking the permission question. And then it opens the door to conversation more than it does opens the door to a yes or a definitive no. And that was really helpful to me when thinking about how to approach this question. And I also want to say that I found people's responses, including members of my family, their reactions to be nonlinear, which is to say they may have been really okay with something early on and then later change their mind, or not okay early on and then later found themselves okay. And that was unexpected, but really important to my own understanding of complicated human brains and the way in which we all sort of metabolize responses to personal stories.
I love that. Yeah, that's so cool. You actually just got me thinking about one of the impactful moments for me in reading Madman in the Woods is reading about Ted's mom and about him as a child, and you there with your own child doing this research. And I'm not going to ask the monster question, but I am going to ask because you have done something that I don't think everyone has spent time doing with Ted, and it is to humanize him. And you don't forgive him, and you aren't making excuses for the choices that he made, but you have put him in context as a real live person who experienced a very early childhood trauma. And it's all woven together. Just, oh my gosh, you had so much research to draw on, just reams of data from the FBI and interviews yourself with Ted and your own personal stories. So how can you just speak to what it looks like to marry that research portion with your personal narrative?
Yes, thank you. So writing this book took me 5 years, and one of the reasons that it did take me so long is the amount of research I felt like I needed to do. And I like to bring this to put it in perspective. Stand up and show you. So the research materials, this is what I'm dealing with. These are literally Mead notebooks that were found in Ted Kaczynski's cabin. And this is what I'm reading. This is what I'm reading for years of my life, and there's thousands of pages. And so I'm sifting through all of these, his innermost thoughts, what he hunted that day, what, and then also there, in addition to those, just the daily journals, because again, in my mind, I feel like it was kind of his need to communicate. This was his only way, and a pen pal that he had. So reading all of these paired with his crime journals, and then in addition, going and interviewing the FBI agent that arrested him and other neighbors and friends that had relationships, as much as you can have a relationship with Ted Kaczynski, was incredibly time-consuming. But I knew about a year into the project that it was the only way that I wanted to write this book. Because, yes, I had my story, my family had their story, and I always wanted to write that. But I needed, just for my own personal reasons, to tell the whole story. And it was definitely something that I don't know if, honestly, I went back in time and knew what I know now about how long it would take to go through all of this. I don't know if I would do that again. But I'm so happy that I did. And again, I just think it was incredibly important to the quality of the story.
I noticed, though, that there are moments where you, I think, are drawing. It feels as though I'm reading, maybe I'm reading this wrong, but it feels as though you're drawing on like his journals and you're aware of what he's doing that day. and then you are coming back in with your narrative voice and saying essentially like, on this day, I was 4 years old collecting rocks, and he showed up at my house. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, like.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it was, being able to write a book that follows, a narrative nonfiction, journey, and really build those journal entries and those experiences into scenes, and not just a memory of my childhood, but yes, what I was doing and then what Ted Kaczynski was doing. And I think that in addition was a challenge as a writer to marry those. And I will say to aspiring writers, aspiring memoirists, trust your gut, because that is what I wanted to do when I wrote this book. I wanted to take pieces of his journal, interviews, my own stories, and combine those. And I had a very early writing coach that said, this can't be done. Like, this is just not a thing. You can't do this. And it crushed me. And I kind of went back to the drawing board, and I'm like, she knows better. She's published, and she must know what she's talking about. I can't do this. And I decided to just try harder and to keep going, and I did. And I mean, of course, with this kind of work, I revised so many times, talked to a different book coach very briefly, and she was like, of course you can. Look at all these different comp titles. And so I started reading all these different comp titles, and lo and behold, I did it. And it's, I think it's pretty great. So.
Have you ever heard back from the original book coach? Say like, see?
I haven't, but yeah. So anyway, trust your gut. That's my point there.
Love it. Courtney, I'm going to ask you this one because I found writing into my OCD and traumas often, my OCD and anxiety is often more challenging than writing into like the physical trauma was for me. And as I was listening to your book, I was thinking about how I had made a pact with myself, like I'm going to write it and then I can cut it. I'm just going to do that, and I'm not going to stress myself out. And I'm curious because you cover so many interesting subjects, and you involve, for instance, your child and people in your family. Did you have to make any similar pacts with yourself in your process?
I did think about just getting it all out and with the potential of cutting later, right? At first, I wasn't writing with an eye towards publishing. And I should say that a lot of this book, as much as I mentioned earlier, deals with daughterhood, it largely also deals with motherhood. And I have 2 sons. And I found becoming a mother to be very profound and intense, and motherhood in general to be both those things. And it raised a lot of questions for me that I felt like an urge to seek answers for. So I was really writing to gain clarity for myself. For example, I had serious anxiety when I was a small child. And when my oldest son was 5, he started to exhibit some of the symptoms that I myself had as a child. And of course, I panicked and was filled with guilt and fear about all of the things that I was responsible for and all of the ways in which he was about to suffer, and wanted to just figure out my own positionality, right? Sort of, what did I think of this? How could I help him? What did this trigger for me? Where did mine sort of come from? And I was writing my way through this not because I was thinking, I will help a fellow reader with their own, mental health. I was really working to gain clarity, which I think is something nonfiction, and particularly an essay, can be really useful for. I mean, the word essay comes from like the idea of seeking clarity, and that is really how I used it as a tool in that way. So I'm sort of answering your question, I think, but I didn't find writing about the mental health challenges to be challenging in so much as I felt them to be essential.
Did you have to prod yourself to like write into any portions of it?
I didn't. Not because it's not difficult stuff, but I'm not really sort of a shy or reserved person in my walking, talking life. And so writing into those places did not feel difficult. But again, I wasn't writing thinking I was going to, publish it and go to Montana and talk about it. But I also feel completely okay with doing that.
I think writing from that place of curiosity is the secret to writing nonfiction. The place of curiosity where you are driven to know better, understand more, place yourself, against the narrative that you're questioning, and to, dig into how that lens affects the world around you. And it's what brings readers to the page because they are curious to understand it through your perspective. I did love very much that chapter as a person who had childhood anxiety and now has children exhibiting signs of anxiety. I found myself
You got this.
not able to listen to it at bedtime, for example. And then I was like, oh gosh, yes. Oh geez, what am I doing to my poor kids?
Well, I want to say the flip side of this, and to let you get on to your next question, is that while on the one hand you may feel, not you, but a general you, may feel extra sort of guilt-ridden or upset by sort of witnessing this, you also have a unique set of skills that maybe another parent watching a child experience this does not. So it's two sides of a coin, and I have the vocabulary to talk to my kids about this stuff, and a lot of tools to help them through it.
That's exactly what I tell my daughter. I say, I know that this is really hard, and I'm the exact right mom for this job because I've experienced it too. And I think that does help a lot. Well, oh my gosh. This is making me want to move into a craft question, and I think we have a couple more minutes for it because we represent sort of a broad cross-section of the memoir genre. We've got memoir and essay collection, true crime, and something resembling a traditional narrative arc. It sounds as though we did not all know what form we expected our work to take or anticipate that we were writing the thing that we did write. So I'm just curious how for each of us it changed along the way, and how we chose the structure we ultimately followed.
So my book, I took 15 years to write, and somewhere along the way I went down the rabbit hole of poetry. So when I started out as a writer, I had this idea that I would write an essay collection about travel and immigration that was centered on the history of the Angel Island immigration station in San Francisco. That was where, during the Chinese exclusion era, Chinese detainees, Chinese immigrants were detained when they waited for the interrogations, the immigration interviews. A lot of them stayed there for 2 weeks. Some stayed there for months. Some who like they were denied. They appealed. They were denied. They were appealed. And so there were a couple people who stayed there for like a year or more. And so when I said I went down the rabbit hole of poetry, was my first book, Islanders, is actually on the Chinese women who were detained at Angel Island. I guess to backtrack, one of the things is the detainees actually wrote poems on the walls, but none of the poems that the women wrote are on record because the women's barracks burned down in a fire. So I imagined what they might have said, realized that I had to learn to write poetry on the fly. And so I went down the rabbit hole for years. I even got an MFA in poetry, etc. And then a few years ago, I came back to the essays, and then I was like, okay, do I have a book? And when I put it together, the essays together, I saw that I have realized my original idea in the sense that it is still an essay collection on travel and immigration that is centered on the history of the Angel Island immigration station. But the structure was very different from what I had envisioned. The most notable is that I feel the book is very conversational and very collage-like. as individual essays, they're fairly traditional individual essays. But when I put them together, I have, the same subject might appear in different essays from different angles. For example, my ideas changed over the course of the book. For example, I have an essay called Split, which is on the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor disaster. One of the things the Japanese government told the people to do was to wear masks to protect themselves against radiation. And then, of course, back then I was like, what the F? This is not going to work. Masks make you so anonymous. And then, of course, when COVID came, my opinions on that changed. So that evolution of ideas, is kind of charted in the book. And that was the part that wasn't what I had initially thought was going to happen.
Speak to it very quickly. When I first wrote my own book, it was a book of short stories. And that is what I thought I was going to publish and what I had written. And it was actually my agent, my literary agent, who is incredible, who said, yeah, this is good, but how do you feel about it? How has this changed you? And it changed the book into a braided memoir. I mean, it took on a completely, a different genre, and I'm really happy that it did. So I think it's important to stay open and, be okay with the changes that progress as you're writing.
So I think I mentioned earlier the ways in which I started just chasing certain questions. And I didn't set out to write this book. I was working on a fiction project. I self-identify as a fiction writer who accidentally wrote a book of nonfiction first. And I gathered these up, these pieces of nonfiction, which were sort of publishing along the way, actually to give a reading, and realized there were really organic threads that bound them, and that those threads pulled all the way through to the next thing I was writing. And it retrospectively makes perfect sense because, again, I was, as a mother of young boys, had a lot of questions and confusions and concerns. And so they came together kind of organically. And there also was kind of a natural arc, which is why my publisher calls it a memoir in essays, which is, by the way, kind of a marketing term. You should know.
I'm a graduate from the UM Creative Writing Program, and I came here interested in writing long-form narrative. So me, narrator on the page, exploring sort of a single subject, blowing it up a la Susan Orlean. And then in workshop, you're turning in all these essays. You just have to keep turning in essays. That's your job in workshop. And by the time I graduated, my thesis advisor, Judy Blunt, was like, if you don't write a memoir and you have this story and you have 100 pages, this is what you need to do. And I was really stunned because that was not my goal, and it wasn't what I planned on putting myself through first as my first publication experience. And so initially mine was going to be a collection of essays too, hopefully mostly funny. And then it turned out that was wrong. So it surprised me a lot. And later, I had to confront the fact that when you're writing essays, they don't lay next to each other to form a traditional narrative arc. And so that's a limitation of the creative writing program, is that you're not there learning how to write a book. You're frequently there writing short stories or essays. And so the learning curve was pretty steep for me in how to tie something that feels like an essay together with another one that feels like an essay, so that they form chapters that feed into each other and then create, a book-long thread of multiple arcs. So yeah, that was a pretty huge surprise, and I was a little sad that I was doing it on my own after I graduated instead of in a program where I was going to have input and people offering feedback for free. So it definitely changed tremendously for me. And turning it into a more traditional narrative arc, I think worked out really well. But mostly because it's a nomadic story and it bounces around with people and places. And so I was able to focus more on the subjects and tie those places together. We are going to maybe have time for...
Can I just add one
Yeah.
thing? So
Yeah.
what we all just said is the writing process never goes according to plan.
Yeah, never.
Okay.
Totally, yeah.
And I think the key thing is to, I mean, there's no formula to it, but it's to kind of feel for like where like, the hot spots where the energy is and just kind of follow it.
Yeah. We are going to be stepping out into the hallway and available to sign books. But I want to just ask one more craft-related question that's brief, and that is that among us, do we have any advice for the memoir writing curious people in the audience? What's some advice you would start with?
I mean, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think especially as we're writing, to take the advice of others, and there will be a lot of advice and criticism after you're done with your book, and, take what you want from it and leave the rest, because you have to trust yourself. And it took me a long 5 years to do that. And so the more you can do that and really look inward, what you want to write, what you want to convey. Just again, take the bits from others that that have the experience that you're looking for, and trust yourself.
So I have a line in the book that says sometimes withholding is more powerful than disclosure. And I think a key thing is to understand what your boundaries are. And it's not to say that you cannot write about certain things, but it comes from you. What you feel that you want to put on the page. And it's even, the other thing I like to say is that writing is not the same as publishing. You can write whatever the hell you want. And and sometimes it helps to just write stuff out, just to get it out, and you can think about publishing, shaping it, all of that later. The other thing, and I know Courtney and Jamie touched on it just now, but asking permission is, you don't have to ask permission, but you also cannot control how people will react. And if you feel you need to put the story out a certain way, I mean, again, there's no right or wrong answers, but you just cannot, you cannot control how other people, and it could be people close to you, will react to what you put out. And even like Courtney says, is you can ask for permission and they might not grant it. So you have to make the choice for yourself whether it's something you want to do.
I'm going to just follow because I think mine's really close. I would say most strenuously, if you're writing memoir, do not write from a place where you're worried about the court of public opinion, and write freely, write for yourself until you're not afraid of your story. And when that fear is gone, then you're ready to consider what happens next, what shape it's going to take, what size your project could be, what else you can do with it. But write freely into your true story first, and don't consider your litigious grandmother or whatever. Mine, thankfully, is now suddenly very gone, and recently congratulated me on my book that I did not know she knew existed, because I have hid it from her specifically to avoid any complications like this.
I think this is all just a great assembly of advice, and I guess what I'll add is to interrogate your instincts, which is to say we've all been wronged and hurt. We've all suffered in our own ways, and what is the aim of your writing a certain story? If you think that this is some sort of revenge fantasy fulfilled, right, is that the right place to write from? I think there are different ways to approach writing and also publishing, which are different things. And just to ensure that we're writing from a place that perhaps is more contextual and comprehensive, as Jamie talked about, perhaps from a place that honors whatever difficulties other people may have endured, a la generational trauma, which I also write about. But I think just asking yourself the question of why you're writing this story is important to do. And the last thing I'll add is that I want to sort of dispute the mantra that writing is a solitary process. I have a couple of really close writer friends. They're actually real friends. I don't know why I call them writer friends. They're also writers who see everything I write. And I perform that same duty for them. And we know each other's brains and work very well. I trust them intimately. They know my aims and objectives. And I think they have so much to do with how my writing has grown and moved. So if you can find those people whose opinions you trust and whose reading eye you respect, that will go a long way to helping you grow as a solitary writer.
Hear, hear. Oh, I just want to say thank you, panel. You're amazing, Courtney, Teow, Jamie. I am so grateful we got to be here together today. And thank you to the Montana Book Festival and to all of you for being here. We're going to get out of here so the next panel has a chance to start on time.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Oh, for any students or aspiring non-fictionists, whether it's memoir or essay, I'm teaching a workshop tomorrow at Fact and Fiction that's going to center a lot around digging into missing or lost memory, a profoundly important part of writing into nonfiction. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.